Hi everyone, in this video we're going to talk about intuitive mark making as it relates to painting flowers. I'm going to show you the marks to make and how to practice them so that you can paint flowers more intuitively without thinking so much about it. And then at the end of the video we're going to take all the brush strokes that we've been practicing and I'm going to show you how to paint flowers with each one. Alright, I want you to do this exercise with me right now. So grab a round brush. I'm using a size 10 and any piece of paper. It can be the back of an old painting. We are going to do our first brush stroke, which I like to call a wave. So it's where you have a thicker base and you're bringing it up kind of to a point, but you're using the side of your brush to sweep up. I do this a lot when I am painting petals. It's kind of the first step in painting a rounded petal shape. You can do that all across your paper, but I'm switching it up here and adding a little bit more to my wave, where I'm doing that same stroke where I'm bringing it up with the body of my brush, and then when I come to the tip, instead of leaving it at the wave, I'm bringing it down a little bit so it kind of has a little tail at the end. This is also a very common stroke that I do, but usually I'm bringing it down together to connect it into a petal. But getting used to that feeling of that shape is what we want here. This next one is actually two strokes together, so we're going to break it down in a second, but this is what it looks like together. Painting the left side and then the right side where they meet in the middle to create kind of this leaf-shaped petal. We'll start with the stroke on the left, using the body of the brush to create the shape, kind of coming to the points but not too much, and adding a nice curve. We'll do all of the left side for a while, and then we'll switch to the right side and do the same thing but curving to the right instead. Then you can combine those together. So bringing a curve on the left and then a curve on the right, making sure you're using the tip of your brush to bring it together at the top and then together at the bottom to finish it off. This next stroke I call the M and W. So it'll make more sense at the end when we paint a flower, so watch that part for sure. But essentially we're going to use the body of our brush kind of at the side and we're going to paint an M shape. You kind of want it close together. You don't want the M to open, but you want to see the bumps of the M. One side can be bigger than the other. It's kind of fun to switch it up and play around with how it looks. And then after we paint a few M's, we're going to do the opposite, which is the W. So the same thing applies. We're using the body of our brush kind of at the side and we're painting a W. We don't want too much of the inside open, but we want the nice curves of the W at the bottom. This next stroke is called the long petal stroke. You're going to use the tip of your brush to start, then push down with the body of your brush and then drag that for the length that you want. If you have a bigger brush, say a size 12, your petal is going to be a lot wider. So the width of your petal will be determined by how big your round brush is. This petal is usually typically pretty straight without any curves in it, but you can play around with it when you're painting your petals on your flowers to kind of give them a little bit of personality. This is typically used for daisies, asters, black-eyed Susans, and you can even use this for sunflowers if you have a wide enough brush. And here you can see the amount of pressure applied to the body of the brush will determine how wide your petal is. This next stroke is called a C-curve stroke. This can be done in a few different ways. I can do it very similarly to how I did the second stroke on our paper, but for this stroke I really want to focus on having a really thin pointed tip, curving around and using the body of the brush to go a lot wider and then coming back to the tip. So it's a very distinct C, it's a very distinct crescent or moon. I use this shape a lot with peonies or roses, but the trick is to really get a nice curve where the center of the curve is the widest part of your stroke. So using the tip, curving around, pushing down on the curve with the body of the brush, and then coming back to the tip to finish the stroke off. This next one I call the dab stroke. It's just a quick little dab. And when you're using a round brush, you just push down with the side of your brush to where you're using the first third to half of your brush to kind of create this squared off stroke. So I'm doing a group of 3 that's not really touching, and then in the second half of my paper I am doing a larger bunch that is touching. So I use this stroke a lot for individual tiny flowers, little buds of flowers, or say lavender where the flower buds are really grouped together. Lots of different reasons you might need a group of flowers that are individual but kind of together, and I use this stroke. This next stroke is not going to look like a petal, but I do this all the time when I am painting flowers intuitively. If there is a petal or the side of a flower that just looks too curved, I will do a quick stroke to give texture on the edge. So for this stroke, you're going to do kind of a 1, 2, 3. It's kind of like the W stroke from before, but we are using the tip of our brush and doing it as quick as possible. Getting used to making quick strokes that feel really fluid and organic is a huge part of intuitive mark making so that it doesn't look too forced. This next stroke is for jagged edged petals, and you'll see I'm also doing 1, 2, 3, but these are all connected and they all go from the top to straight down. This gives a very jagged edge, and I use this all the time when I'm painting cosmos. This next stroke is really not a specific petal, but it is a great way to practice how fluid you need to move your brush when you're painting your petals. Sometimes you're painting the petals and you really just need to get used to how to move your brush out to the left and out to the right in this curved structure. So I'm using the first half of my brush, pushing down slightly into the body and trying to curve my strokes to the left for the first half of the paper. And then now I'm trying to curve my strokes in a swirling motion out to the right. It is a lot harder to swirl out to the right for me. It is easier to swirl to the left. And so you can probably tell that on this page. That's another good reason to practice it. This next stroke is similar to the long petal stroke, except it's fast. We're not worrying about tip to body, to pushing down pressure, to releasing. No, we're not worried about it. We're just doing a strike. We're using the roundness and shape of our brush to make these sweeping, quick strokes onto our paper. And there are so many different uses for this, from the centers of flowers to the edges of flowers to flowers that actually need that shape for their petals. Okay, and if you're feeling ready, let's start painting flowers with these strokes. If not, keep practicing. I will be here for the second half of the video whenever you feel up to it. Okay, let's paint the first flower. You'll notice that when I'm painting some of these flowers, I'm using a few different strokes. So this first one resembles the first stroke or stroke pattern that we were doing. And then that second petal looked closer to that second stroke. And then the third one looked kind of like the second stroke, but maybe flared out starting from the center. And then the bottom is just a bunch of quick strokes all together to create curvature so I can get the right angle. So the reason why we want to practice intuitive mark making and practice making those shapes with your brush is so that when you go to put your brush on the paper and you have an idea of what you want to create, you can create it. So this is a typical flower, buttercup, and we can use all different kinds of strokes to paint it. This next one is the M and W. And you can kind of see it coming together a little bit more now. I use this for small flowers, for forget-me-not type flowers, and you can really change up and play around with how the M sits, how the W sits on the bottom, keeping the centers open for a nice beautiful center, and playing with the shape of the M and the W to manipulate the direction the flower is pointing. You'll notice that while the flower is still wet, for some of these flowers I go in with a higher concentration of color and tap that around the open centers. This just gives a nice gradual blend while it's still wet, and then I'm going to let all of the flowers fully dry before I add the final center and the greenery. For example, here on these forget-me-nots that I'm painting, if I did the yellow center right now, it would blend together with the blue and look really green, which I do not want. I want a nice, bright, beautiful, clear center. So we're going to leave the center open and let everything dry. Now I'm mixing up an orange for the cosmos flowers, and these were the ones that were 1, 2, 3 quick strokes together that make a petal with a jagged edge. And I really, really love using this for all kinds of flowers, but my favorite is the cosmos. And you can play with how short the petal is and how much it flares out, because that will also change the way the flower is pointing. And then you can even do one that is kind of seen from the side, so you're only seeing half the petals with a more prominent center. Next, we're going to do lavender, and lavender has that dabbing stroke. So lavender is grouped together in little clusters, and then there's a section of greenery, and then there's another cluster. So we're just painting little clusters using that dabbing stroke, and we can make a bigger, thicker stroke by pushing more on our brush, on the body of the brush, towards the bottom of the plant, and then smaller petals up towards the top. Again, we're going to be adding all of the greenery later, but I want most of it to completely dry. So it's going to be a bunch of flower petals all over the place, but the greenery will tie it all together at the end. Now we're using that really long petal stroke where we focus on the tip of the brush, pushing down for the body of the brush, and then releasing up. You can tell that I'm not being super even with my strokes because I like to give the flower a little bit of personality. Here we're creating like a daisy or a black-eyed Susan, and you can really have fun with how the strokes layer over the top of each other, the direction that they're pointing, how short or long they are, and it will still give the impression that it's a daisy if you do it in this nice circular rounded shape. Just remember that flowers are shaped like a cone. The petals are attached at the tip of the cone, and then they come out and flare open at the circular part of a cone. And if you think about that, you'll always know to bring your petals down into a center point, and that will make them look more realistic. And then before moving on to the next flower, I wanted to add a little bit more detail around the center of the cosmos and also around the base of the lavender. So this is color that is not blending in because the flower petals are not wet anymore, but it adds a really nice depth to the flowers, and I don't necessarily want it blending in with the centers or with the greenery, so we're going to add it now so that it can also fully dry before we move on to other pieces for those flowers. Now we're going to paint two of the hardest flowers. The first one is a peony. So I'm using all kinds of different strokes to create this front fan. But you'll notice I start using that 1, 2, 3 really quick W kind of stroke. This is where I use that the most often, is around peonies. So I focus on a really fluffy front fan of petals, and then I do a quick tiny curve or moon shape, little waves in the back that dip down in between those front petals without necessarily touching. And then I try to leave it as much as possible because I feel like peonies can be really overworked. And then to finish it off, I try to do some little petals around the front that are kind of open and fanning out. Then from here, I just try to focus on letting color tell the story. So I'll pick up some deeper magenta to add while it's still wet so that we can kind of play around with the idea of shadows and depth within the peony. And then I will also pick up some really bright yellow while everything is still wet again, and put that on those back petals only, especially right down in the center. This is going to make it blend in really nicely and look like the center of the flower, the little stamen coming out. And when it dries, it's going to look amazing because it's going to be nice and gradual blend. I will say peonies take a lot of practice. I always hated my peonies when I first practiced them. Just keep practicing. Use it as stroke practice. Use big brushes, small brushes, and then the same goes for roses. Just keep practicing them. The rose uses that C curve, the one that has the really thin edge, and then we kind of push out as we curve around and then bringing it back down to a really thin edge. So the center of the rose is a little bit more wonky and tight. We're not really pushing out in the center as much because we want it to be really tight like a rose. But then as we come farther out, the rounded part of the C curve is actually representing the tip of a petal. So as we're coming out of the rose, we want the tips of the petals to be wider and more open, so it looks like the flower is more open. So we can make those curves wider by pushing down a little bit harder with our brush, and then using the tip to help curve that around, layering it kind of every other. So we don't want it to be perfectly stacked on top of each other. We want to layer those petals nicely. And then once you have your bigger petals and you have the direction that your flower is pointing in and everything looks good, you'll want to do a few petals on the back so that it looks like with perspective you're seeing more of the petals in front of you and less of the petals in the back. And then I like to go again while everything is still wet, pick up a really punchy red or pink, in this case with this more rosy colored flower, add that in to the inside curve of the C shape or moon shape so that it looks like a shadow as the petal is going down into the center of the flower. For this next flower, I'm using that last stroke we did with the really quick, sharp strokes, and I'm creating some quick flower petals in blue. Kind of reminds me of a bachelor's button. So I'm fanning them out, and then I'm going to add the bulbous greenery at the bottom at the end. So there's a lot of different flowers you could use this stroke for, anything that has some kind of spike, and then you can always use this stroke for the centers of your flowers as well. And then while it's still wet, I'm going in with some ultramarine blue to really have fun with the different blues here and add some contrast. Now going back to the dab stroke that we used on the lavender, we can use the dab stroke to create an individual flower. So here I've got 3 individual flowers, and then I can attach them with some greenery. So it's a great way to create little flowers, buds, and filler flowers. For this flower, I'm using that circular stroke we did near the end to create individual petals to make a small flower that has a really large center. And then for the final flower on the page, I am using that 2-stroke petal we did near the beginning of our practice page, where we have the stroke on the left and then the stroke on the right, which creates this really leafy, pointed petal shape. And I'll just do a couple here that are pretty exact, and then you can change up the shape and the direction that they're going so that it looks like you have better perspective and that the flower is pointed to the left. Now we are going to add the centers to the flowers. I'm going to use a kind of magenta brown for the center of these daisies, but really you can totally have fun with this. You can look at a reference picture and keep it really realistic, or you can change it up and do something fun. You could use black, green, a purpley, brown, magenta color. You can use just yellow, which is what I typically do. You could do yellow for the very middle center and then green for the outer ring. You can do lots of different things. You can keep it really simple. You can make it really textured like I did on the daisies. Have fun with this step, be creative, or look at reference pictures and try to go as realistic as you want. The paper that I'm using is Baohong cold press watercolor paper. I love this paper lately. And I am also using paint by Sparrow. This is actually a collaboration paint palette that we came up with together because I love using split primaries. So this has the traditional primary colors on the left and then the cyan, magenta, yellow primary colors on the right that I like to use the most, with an addition of indigo and a olive green color. So you've been seeing me kind of mess around with putting all of those colors together. I love color mixing. Anyway, check out Kelly's site if you want more information about her paints. I love her paints. Best watercolors I've ever used. They're so bright, creamy, very fun to use and work with. So check her out if you're interested. Her details will be in the description below. So now we've moved on to the greenery, which really isn't the point of this video. It was all about intuitive mark making for flowers. But last week I did intuitive mark making for greenery. So if you want more detailed information about how I make my leaves and how I practice intuitive mark making for my leaves, I will also have that video linked below. One of my biggest tips though when you are creating greenery, especially intuitively, is to be very light and be very mindful with the tip of your brush. So using the very tip, I try to keep it really squiggly and organic and leave gaps. And then if you feel like, oh, that stem is too thin or I don't like that gap, you can add more. It's really hard when you're doing intuitive mark making and trying to make everything loose and organic. If you use too heavy of a stroke, you can't take it away. And it can really kind of ruin the feeling or the aesthetic of something being really light and flowy if your brush stroke was too heavy in the beginning. So I like to start with really thin brush strokes and add more from there with leaves. Another tip that I have, and if you've been following me for a while, you know I love implied lines, and I love talking about implied lines. So here's my little soapbox spiel about implied lines. Your brain will connect the dots, especially with leaves and in this loose style. So you do not have to connect every leaf to a stem. You do not have to make everything perfectly connected. You can have little dots of leaves floating out in space that are not connected, and your brain knows what it is. Especially if it's green, you don't even have to have the exact shape. Your brain will fill in the gaps because our brains are so smart. And that, my friends, is all I have for you today. I'm finishing up the greenery on this piece, but those are the marks that I would practice over and over again to make your mark making more intuitive when it comes to painting flowers in this loose and flowy style. I hope this was a really helpful video for you and that you take these practices into your own daily paintings and keep practicing. It's going to get better, and I'll see you next time. Bye.